In 1876, a black family in Kentucky owned more land than most white settlers in their county. They were educated. They were wealthy. They were respected. And one autumn night, armed men surrounded their home. What happened next was so horrific, so deliberate, so cold, that newspapers refused to print the truth. Courts destroyed the records. And for over a century, America pretended this family never existed, until now. Picture Kentucky in the years after the Civil War. The guns had gone silent. The Union had won. And 4 million enslaved people were suddenly, impossibly free. On paper, at least the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship. The 15th promised the right to vote. 3 amendments? 3 promises. 3 pieces of paper that were supposed to change everything, but in places like Kentucky, a border state that never seceded, never quite let go of its Confederate sympathies, freedom wasn't a guarantee. It was a dare. Black code sprang up overnight, placing chains with contracts that bound freed people to the same land they had worked as slaves. The Ku Klux Klan rode through the night, their violence designed to answer one question: what happens when you give black people rights? The answer, according to white supremacy, had to be terror. It had to be fire. It had to be blood. But not everyone accepted that answer. In Henderson County, a man named Samuel Foster was writing a different story entirely. Samuel Foster was born enslaved in 1838. He learned to read by candlelight, hiding books beneath floorboards, risking the whip for every stolen word, every stolen hour of knowledge. In 1863, through a combination of saved wages, careful negotiation, and sheer, extraordinary determination, Samuel purchased his own freedom. 2 years later, when emancipation came for everyone else, he didn't celebrate for long. He got to work. By 1870, Samuel had purchased 40 acres. By 1873, he owned 160. By 1876, just 11 years after the end of slavery, Samuel Foster owned 340 acres of prime Kentucky, farmland more than most white families in the county could claim. He grew tobacco. He raised livestock. He operated a small mill that ground grain for both black and white farmers. His business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, and it was serving everyone. He married Elizabeth, a woman who had taught herself to read using the discarded primers of the white children she'd once served. Not given an education, she claimed one. Together, they raised 3 children. Marcus, 17 years old, sharp-minded and already attending a black college in Nashville. Sarah, 14, who could recite poetry and solve algebra. And little James, 8 years old, who practiced his letters every single night before bed. The Foster family was everything Reconstruction promised. They were proof, living, breathing, working proof, that black people didn't need white paternalism, didn't need to be controlled, managed, or kept in poverty for their own good. They were literate, land-owning, voting citizens, and that made them dangerous. Not because they were violent, not because they were radical, but because their very existence challenged the lie that white supremacy was built on, that black people were inherently inferior, incapable of self-governance, destined for subservience. Samuel Foster's success was an argument no editorial could refute. No law could suppress, so it had to be destroyed. The signs started small, the way they always do. In 1875, anonymous letters appeared, nailed to the Foster's fence in the middle of the night. The language was vile. The message was simple: know your place, or be reminded of it. Their mill was vandalized. Twice tools went missing. Fences were cut in the night. When Samuel reported these incidents to the sheriff, the man barely looked up from his desk. No investigations. No arrests. Just a shrug and a suggestion that maybe Samuel was imagining things. White merchants who had done business with the family for years suddenly refused their money. The local Democratic newspaper ran editorials about the dangers of, and I'm quoting the language of the time, uppity coal rods, who forgot their station. They never named the Fosters directly. They didn't have to. Everyone knew at the Black Baptist church the family attended, which also served as a school and a community meeting house. The pastor spoke in careful code during Sunday service. Success. He reminded his congregation, made them visible. And visibility made them vulnerable, but Samuel couldn't stay quiet. Because this was 1876, an election year, and the stakes had never been higher. Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden were locked in one of the most contested presidential races in American history. In Kentucky, the battle lines were stark. White Democrats were using every tool available to suppress the black Republican vote. Intimidation, poll taxes, outright violence. Samuel Foster had organized voter registration drives. He had testified to federal marshals about the intimidation tactics he'd witnessed. He had become a symbol, a rallying point for black political participation in Henderson County, and symbols in that time and place were marked for elimination. The conspiracy didn't form in shadows. It formed in plain sight in the back rooms of the courthouse. In the private clubs where the county's most powerful men gathered, the sheriff was there. So was the county judge. So were the largest landowners. The newspaper editor. The men who controlled credit and commerce and law. They weren't random vigilantes. They were the establishment, and they had a problem. Samuel Foster, not just him really, but what he represented. His prosperity threatened the racial order they depended on. His political organizing threatened their grip on power. His refusal to defer to bow, to play the role of grateful freedmen, threatened their sense of who they were. So, they made a plan. They would wait until after the election when the federal troops stationed in Kentucky as part of Reconstruction enforcement would be at their most distracted. They would make an example so brutal, so complete, that no other black family in the county would dare to dream that big again. Election night had come and gone. Rutherford B. Hayes would eventually win through a corrupt compromise that would end Reconstruction and abandon black Americans to nearly a century of Jim Crow terror. But none of that was clear yet. In the Foster home, the family was settling in for the night. Elizabeth had just tucked James into bed. His primer was still open on the nightstand, the letters he'd been practicing before sleep. Marcus was home from college for the election, talking politics with his father in the front room. Sarah was already asleep. The house was quiet, outside in the darkness. 30 to 40 armed men were gathering. They didn't wear hoods. They didn't need to. They knew no one would stop them. They knew the sheriff was one of them. They knew the courts would protect them. They knew history would forget. The first shot shattered. The front window, just before midnight, Samuel grabbed his rifle. The one possession, the 14th Amendment theoretically, protected his right to own, and rushed his family toward the root cellar. But there were too many men, too many guns. They had surrounded the house. Someone shouted to set it on fire. Within minutes, flames were climbing the walls. The Foster family faced an impossible choice: burn alive inside, or run into the gunfire outside. Samuel made a decision. He would hold the doorway. Elizabeth would take Sarah and James and run for the woods. Maybe in the chaos and darkness they could escape. Marcus refused to leave his father at 17 years old. He had spent his entire life watching Samuel build something from nothing, watching him stand tall when the world demanded he bow. He had watched his father absorb insult after insult, threat after threat, and still get up every single morning and work that land. He had watched his father become a man that history was supposed to say couldn't exist. Marcus wasn't going to run. Father and son stood in that doorway together. Firing into the mob? Trying to buy Elizabeth and the children a few more seconds, the men outside returned fire without hesitation. Samuel Foster fell first, then Marcus, both cut down in the home they had built. On the land they had earned in the woods, Elizabeth ran, clutching Sarah with one hand and James with the other, their bare feet bleeding on the frozen ground. The sound of gunfire echoing behind them. They ran until they couldn't hear it anymore. They ran until dawn. When the sun rose on November 9th, a crowd gathered at what remained of the foster home. The house was ash and charred timber. 2 bodies lay in the yard uncovered. Displaced people came to look. Not to mourn, to look. To see what happened to black people who forgot their place. Someone took photographs. Those photographs would later disappear along with so much else. The sheriff arrived mid-morning, surveyed the scene with the casual authority of a man completing routine business, and filed his official report. The mob had acted in self-defense against a Negro insurrectionist. No arrests would be made. The case was closed before it ever opened. Within 48 hours, the local newspaper ran its story. The headline read, "Negro Insurrectionists Put Down." The article described Samuel Forster as a dangerous radical plotting an armed uprising. His literacy was framed as evidence of seditious intent. His property was called ill-gotten gains. His voter registration work was reframed as political insurgency. The story spread. Democratic newspapers across the South picked it up, each version more embellished than the last. By the time Northern papers mentioned it at all, it was a footnote, just another disturbance in the post-war South. It's barely worth a paragraph. The narrative was set. Samuel Foster was not a victim. He was a threat that had been neutralized. Elizabeth tried to fight back, hiding in Cincinnati with her surviving children, using a different name. She still tried. She gathered what documents she had, the land deeds, the tax receipts, that proved the family's legitimacy. She traveled back to Henderson County and attempted to file charges. The county clerk laughed in her face when she insisted. On seeing the judge, the same judge who had helped plan the attack, he dismissed her testimony as unreliable. She was a woman. She was colored. Her word meant nothing. The foster land was seized for unpaid taxes, despite Elizabeth's receipts proving otherwise. It was divided among the men who had killed her husband and son. The mill was dismantled. The church school was burned within 6 months. Every trace of the Foster family's existence has been systematically erased. And then came the final betrayal. In 1877, as part of the compromise that handed Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was officially over. The few investigators who had cared about cases like the Fosters were reassigned or dismissed. The fragile infrastructure of justice that had existed, imperfect as it was, collapsed overnight. Court records went missing. Newspaper archives were selectively damaged. Witnesses were threatened into silence. The Foster massacre joined thousands of others in a mass grave of forgotten history. For more than a century, it was as if Samuel, Elizabeth, Marcus, Sarah, and James Foster had never existed at all. Asterisk. Here's what the history books didn't tell you. The Foster family wasn't an isolated case. They were representative of something enormous that this country has spent 150 years trying to forget. Between 1865 and 1876, Black Americans in the South accumulated an estimated $20 million in property, the equivalent of $500 million today. They created 4,000 schools. They elected officials to local, state, and federal government. They built thriving businesses, vibrant communities, a future that looked nothing like slavery. And then came the counter-revolution. The Colfax Massacre in 1873. 150 black people murdered. The Vicksburg Massacre in 1875. 300 dead. Dozens of smaller atrocities. Each one designed to answer the same question white supremacy kept asking. What happens when you give black people freedom? The answer was always fire and blood. An erasure. The Foster massacre wasn't random violence. It was policy enforced by mobs, legitimized by courts and newspapers. The prosperity black families built during Reconstruction was systematically stolen. And the theft was covered up so thoroughly that most Americans today have no idea it ever happened. We talk about the racial wealth gap today as if it's some mysterious force of nature. some inevitable consequence of ancient, abstract inequalities. But it's not a mystery. It's inheritance. The inheritance of land seized. Businesses burned. Families destroyed. The self-made white fortunes of the early 20th century, many of them were built on stolen black property. This isn't a fringe theory. This is documented history. The system didn't just steal their present. It stole their past, so that future generations wouldn't know what had been taken. Wouldn't know what was owed *. In 2015, something remarkable happened. A historian digging through a forgotten box at the Kentucky Historical Society found a journal. It belonged to a white woman whose husband had been part of the mob that killed the Fosters. Her entries from November 1876 were written in a shaking hand filled with shame and horror and fear. She described the attack in detail. She named names, every one of them a pillar of Henderson County society, and she wrote something that cuts right to the heart of it all. They say they did it to protect us. I think they did it because they couldn't stand to see a colored man succeed where they had failed. That journal had been hidden for 113 years. Someone in that woman's family knew it was too dangerous to destroy, but too damning to reveal. So they buried it. And it stayed buried until long after everyone involved was dead. But the Foss's story did not end in that burned house. Elizabeth, Sarah, and James survived. They made it to Cincinnati, changed their last name, disappeared into the great migration of black refugees fleeing Southern terror. Elizabeth worked as a washerwoman until she died in 1904. She never spoke publicly about what happened. Sarah became a teacher in the segregated schools, quietly excellent, quietly defiant. James became a minister and a secret keeper. He told his children the story. They told theirs. A whispered history, passed down through generations who weren't sure the world was ready to hear it yet. In 1998, his great-great-granddaughter, Dr. Patricia Foster Williams, a historian with a PhD and a bone-deep certainty that her family's story mattered, began investigating. She found land deeds in county archives that had somehow survived. Bills of sale, letters. Piece by piece, she reconstructed proof that her family had existed, had prospered, had been erased, and had mattered * those 340 acres the Foster family owned. Today, it's a golf course and a luxury subdivision. The property is worth approximately $12 million. Not a single historical marker mentioned what happened there until 2019, when Dr. Foster Williams fought for 5 years to get a plaque installed that reads, "In memory of the Foster family, whose prosperity was punished and whose story was silenced." The current property owners fought the plaque. They said it would hurt their property values. Think about that. The land is worth millions because it was stolen, and acknowledging the theft might lower the price. In 2023, Dr. Foster Williams filed a lawsuit for reparations on behalf of her family. She's not just asking for money. She's demanding that America remember. The case is ongoing. The state of Kentucky argues that too much time has passed, that the statute of limitations protects them from the consequences of a massacre. Dr. Foster Williams has a different view of time. "They took 139 years to hide the truth," she said. "I'll take as long as I need to uncover it." History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember. The Foster family built a legacy of black excellence in the immediate aftermath of slavery. They did it through sheer discipline, courage, and refusal to accept the world's limits as their own. America's response was to burn it down and bury the ashes. But their great-great-great-granddaughter dug it back up, and now you know their names. Samuel, Elizabeth, Marcus, Sarah, James. They were here. They mattered. And they will not be erased again.